CIT 226, Data Integrity and Security, and this is chapter number 8, talking about SQL injection, exploitation, and defense. So the objective of the chapter is to define SQL injection exploitation, identify ways intruders gather the information from network or the infrastructure, information related to the kind of database being used, and the kind of programming language which is used with that database. Describe common strategies for exploiting database infrastructure, identify common SQL statements and SQL constructs used to exploit the weakness. For example, they use sometimes the union clause, like if you are constructing a query, you are having a union function in between the query to join the two queries together. Apply exploitation for the purpose of identifying infrastructure weakness, and identify defense strategies against the SQL injection exploits. Now, exploitation acts of using system vulnerability for the purpose of gaining access to the access or control. Even if we are talking about operating systems, programming languages, web servers, applications, databases, the weakness or configuration issues in any database or application leads towards the vulnerabilities. There are some default settings in every application, like we know that in Microsoft SQL Server, the default account with the highest privileges is a system administrator account. On Oracle is sys account. So everyone knows it, and people usually target the same accounts because they know the username. All they need to do is to work on the password. Now, there are ways through which you can create an account similar to a sys account or a system administrator account, and you can have the same privileges and have a different username for that. Just like we covered in CIT 225 network security and penetration testing, that you can change the ports for the mail servers, not necessary that you'll go with the default ports which are available. Now, does not allow result in control, depends on the effectiveness of the SQL query injection techniques and usefulness of generated output. Now, anyone who's targeting the databases, keep in mind that they are usually very good in writing queries, joining queries, union queries, conditional queries, and trying to gather the information. Mostly hackers are good into programming and about these databases, etc. If you are good into programming, you'll be good in writing queries as well, because it's all conceptual, and the way you construct the query to gather the information helps in gathering the information, because you are writing almost the same code back end to fetch the information from the database. To defend a system for the successful exploitation, security professionals must be aware of means to derive information and what information to protect. Locating a weakness, for example, first step is the intrusion process. Now, these steps are always not successful, but they give you an insight towards the penetration, or how the penetrator would try to exploit the weakness of the system in order to get hold of the information which is stored on the databases. Attacker gains access to the database but does not have knowledge of its content. Content means the overall structure of the database. How many tables are there? What's the database schema? Where you are saving the usernames? If you are having separate tables, having the categories. For example, if you are defining an administrator and the category code for that is 1. If you are creating another table having users only, and if the role you'll define as number 1, so it would get the information from another table that number 1 is the administrator, so all the privileges related to the administrator would be assigned to that user. So they'll have to check the overall structure of the database, that how you are maintaining it. That's the reason why we segregate or we normalize the table, so that the information is not leaked out just by if one table is compromised. If one table is compromised having a username and password, that does not specify clearly if that user is an administrator or a general user, unless and until if you get hold of a username and you get the code corresponding to that, and then you can match that. If it's a category roll number 1, it means that all those users with the roll number 1 are the administrators. So they'll have to have the knowledge of its contents. Goal: to construct a theoretical picture of the infrastructure, gather details, aids, goals, and obtaining the access. Now, database schema: overall logical structure of objects within the database, and includes stored procedures, tables, views, and users. Now, there are different views of the database as well, which are shared with the programmers. For example, if you want to get a specific information without having any admin access of all the students who graduated in the past 2 years, so that's a static information which is available on a table, and it would be updated on semester basis, that every semester if students are graduating, it would keep a record that all these students graduated in these terms. So he'll have an access to those views, and he'll be reading the information from there. So if those tables and access to the information is leaked out, the persons would be able to fetch the information from there without using any inferential queries on it. Information about database: knowing the database vendor and version is necessary. It's important to know that which kind of database is it. Is it mySQL, SQL Server, or Oracle? Because the query syntax of it is slightly different, how you craft the query in order to get the information from the database. When vendor version info attacker, with vendor version info, the attacker can infer SQL language syntax to construct the injections, available default procedures which are there, and you know that these are the known procedures for this programming language or for this database. Method for processing the queries, storage mechanism utilized, and the large portion of the schema. Then it's easy for the knowledgeable intruder who have the basic information about the database itself. Multiple clues need to assert database vendor and type, clues that aid intruders in identify the vendor, for example, the scripting language, platform, and database response. Now, there are certain things which you can pass the queries on SQL Server, mySQL, or Oracle, and they would show you in response that what kind of server is it, what's the version of the database, and what's the security level of that database. Now, that comes in, as we discussed earlier on programmers, that how can you hold that kind of information not to be shown on the screen. So if it is properly written and your application is able to filter unnecessary information to be displayed on the website, it becomes very difficult for the intruder to penetrate in your database. Now, scripting language database vendors often learn towards one or more languages. For example, if a PHP is there as the application which is being used on the website, it could be any buying or selling website or classified ads, etc. If you see that it's a PHP website, there are high chances that it would be working with MySQL Server in the backend. .NET usually uses SQL Server because .NET is from Microsoft and SQL Server is also from Microsoft. Now, Oracle has a relationship with the JavaScript, so all kind of Java tags can be targeted towards the Oracle databases. Now, platforms of Microsoft SQL Server based the foundation means that if it's running, most probably the backend database would, the backend operating system, server operating system is is Microsoft Server, indicating the Windows points for SQL Server. Now, open source operating systems often used to support MySQL and Oracle because they work on Linux and Unix operating systems. Platforms provide only one small clue that every configuration is built on unique needs. Database response provide most reliable means to identify database differences in syntax and error format exist between the database. Error code can be valuable piece of information. Vendor website provides the information on error codes. For example, if a user is not found, an account is not found on SQL Server, it could give you a warning code like 18456. If you're trying to do the same thing on MySQL server, it would show you like localhost and error code 1061. Then same thing for Oracle. If you're trying it, it's showing you that aura 010 and then 17. That indicates that there is a code associated with the error message that you see on the screen. Now, if we know this information, the hackers can easily find or Google these codes to find exactly what's the reason they are not able to authenticate. If it's not showing that the username and password is not found on the table, it would show the warning, and they can easily Google it to find the information related to the problem or the error that they are getting on the screen. Now, you'll have to suppress these kind of error messages which appear on the screen. You can change it to something else so that the penetrator or the hacker will not know exactly what's the reason of this error message. Now, identifying the version can be equally important. To identify the vendor gives insight into the system capabilities. Intruder can take advantage of the known vulnerabilities for a given reason. If someone is still using old SQL server, which is version 2008 or 2012, you know that there are some known vulnerabilities in those databases. Now, if the attacker would know that these were the known vulnerabilities of it, they will exploit it and they'll craft a special kind of intrusion into those databases, which would give them access to the databases itself. Now, once the database vendor is identified, locating version number can be very easy task. Standard query is used to return the version number of the system. For example, to discover the version in SQL Server, you run a select query at select at version. It would return the version of the SQL Server, processor, operating system, service pack, and build. All that information would be available to you, with the help of which you can get the basic details which are required and very important for any hacker to penetrate in the system. Possible results of injecting statement as a string parameter within the web application result in application input and output has not been filtered. As we discussed in previous chapter, that input and output should be filtered before the information is passed on to the database or before the information is passed on to the screen, if expected parameters is a string. Now, possible results of injection is error handling also. If a statement is constructed incorrectly, if expected parameter is a number, or a message may provide a necessary information about the system which might expose the system for threats. If nothing is returned, application filters input and output. If application is configured to handle error messages in this way, intruder will need to use trial and error approach till he'll get the information which he is looking for. The statements to determine database name, location, and language is being used. Administrator should become familiar with these statements, helps understand the amount of the information that may be gathered during the exploitation. Now, extracting the real data means that the techniques presented in previous section allow intruders to gather basic information which is required to craft any kind of attack. Based on knowledge gained about the database, intruder can construct meaningful queries to gather the data. Now, he got some basic information, as we saw last time, on yum.com, which was selling some dairy products and food products on their website. Once the result was presented on the screen in ASP language, you saw a small code appearing in the address line where it was showing that you are actually searching in the category of dairy. Now, they'll write further queries in the address bar extending the same address and would execute it. That would pull more information from the database and would display it on the screen. Exploitation attacks equipped to move deeper into the system. Targets can be located and extracted. Endless number of SQL statements can be injected into the database. Intruder has capability to access the database as a typical user. Not the administrator, just a general user who will be searching or writing the queries in order to get the information. Access is restricted by the privileges of the user. So even if it's a very basic kind of information which is being shared You don't need the admin privileges to get this basic information. Next section explores the common statements used in the SQL injections, assuming the attacker is working under restricted conditions. So union statements still work in that. Now, a powerful tool in the SQL injection statement, intruder attaches his or her own queries onto pre-existing legitimate statements. Union operator combines two or more SQL statements and then execute it all together. For example, yum.com index.asp category dairy, then he is writing the union query starting from here, where he is selecting the table and information schema of all the information about the tables and the database schema by writing this union query. Make sure that there are two dashes in the end, which helps them retrieving the information from the database and displaying it on the screen. Both results must be combined and returned provided the syntax is correct. Table name call asking for the database to provide name of the tables for a specific database. Double dashes at the end comment the rest of the statement. When using the union query statement, data type and number of columns must be same. So if you are trying to get information from another table, table number 1 had 2 columns, the table number 2 in the union must have 2 columns as well. Only then it would get the information of both tables, combine it together and show it on the screen. If the number of columns is a mismatch between the query number 1 and query number 2, you don't get the results on the screen. Method of determining how many columns are being used in the original query. So you will write a statement in the place of the select statement in the URL until the error message disappears. For example, yum.com, and keep an eye that they are using null in between. They use union and then use select null from information schema tables, and then he'll keep on incrementing 2 times null and 3 times null till he'll get the information about how many tables are or how many fields are there in that specific table. Once the number of columns are being called in original request has been determined, data type can be determined using the trial and error. Replace each column one at a time with a specific data type, and then they'll proceed with that. Now, how can you stop it over here? Because he's constantly trying for getting the information about the tables as well as the information on the schema. Now, if constantly wrong results are going and not passed on, there is a usual limit on the database's backend itself or the application that if a specific number of wrong results are generated, just block the connection, because it's obvious that someone is trying to check the information on regular intervals. Now, we'll be covering it later. Just like in penetration testing, you give a delay in between the queries to be processed, like a delay time or a sleep time, so that the server would not pick it as an attack. It would consider it as a regular communication with that server. It becomes very easy if that server is not heavily loaded and not lots of users are trying to get the information, and all of a sudden if it is under an attack and there is high transactions taking place on the database, it is obvious that someone is trying to get some information. Maybe they are not getting it, but they are constantly trying to fetch the information from the same database. Replace each column one at a time with a specific data, for example, category, and then union, select null, table name null, from information this. And then they'll be passing the information now in order to get the information from the table name and information schema. Now, these statements that return an error, the incorrect data type exists, can attempt different data type or leave it as null, because if the data type was also different between the two tables from which you are trying to get the information, it would still give you no results. Now, there are some automated tools available for that, which would try it and then it would give you the results. You don't need to type in the queries yourself to check it. All you need to do is provide the basic structure of the initial URL with a small query, it would write the union queries after that, and it would keep on trying on iterations, and in the application you can define what's the sleep time or the pause time in between trying those queries. Now table name can be replaced with column name once you'll get this information, and same strategy is applied for identifying the viewing the columns in the database. Now second way to get that information is using the conditions. Condition statements, if a specified condition is true, a specified action should take place. Just like we read earlier that where AB is equal to A plus B. So it's a statement true. Likewise, it would check that if it's an administrator account, if it's true, show 1, else give an error. So the moment they get a flag as 1, it means that it found that it was an administrator account. If a specified condition is false, an alternative condition should be taken, advantageous in situations where union statements are not allowed. Example of a question of an intruder is, am I the administrator? So it would be checking it by gathering the error messages, could alert the system administrator that intruder action is taking place on the database. Someone is constantly trying on the system. Time-based responses, effective means to find an answer to a constructed conditional statement. Intruders create a conditional statement that includes delays in responses. Intruders can infer the answer based on the presence or the absence of a pause. So if you are defining as the administrator that the results would be displayed after a certain time, it won't be immediate that you'll be able to see the results on the screen. If it's a small database which is being used by a group of users, that's fine. But if you are giving pauses for all results to be displayed on the screen and you are having thousands of results, it would add unnecessary pressure to on the web server. Plus, the users would be thinking that why they are getting a very slow response on the screen whenever they are trying to run any query. Now Microsoft SQL Server, for example, you can wait for delay as 5 seconds, you can define it, and then likewise on mySQL Server you can define a benchmark for the milliseconds, defining and then encoding it. And then just like on Oracle also, you can give a sleep time of 5 seconds or more depending on the kind of platform you are using. Now disadvantages of a time delay. Delays itself causes processes to take longer time to show the results on the screen. Another method of using a condition statement is designing the statement to return different results for true statements as for false statements. Might not be effective depending on the database strategies. I think we must stop it here today, and we'll continue it in our next lecture.